our next question was, how and why does Truth and Reconciliation affect every other Canadian and not just Indigenous peoples?
Well, the interesting thing is that in the work of the TRC, we found that much of what was done to Indigenous people in residential schools was quite abusive. So they were abused not only physically and sexually, but the abuse also took place educationally and emotionally. And by that I mean that they were taught that Indigenous people at the time that they first came into contact with settlers had no rights. They had no government. They had no spiritual belief systems. They were not Christian. They were uncivilized. They were pagans. They were heathens. They were people who kind of lived in the woods and didn't have organized, structured societies. And so all of that, of course, we have shown in both in our report and in other scholarly work, all of that is untrue. Indigenous people at the time of contact were living in very organized societies. We're living in cities and towns and villages that had huge numbers of people living within them. They had selected leadership that was selected in accordance with their traditions and their beliefs. In the Mohawk system, for example, all the leaders were selected by the women of the community. And in many other tribes, it was done the same way, where the women decided who the leaders were going to be. And that there were defined roles for men and women, that there were rules of behavior that were required of people. There were laws that were in place. So things such as property rights were recognized. There were civil laws relating to marriage, to divorce, to child welfare decision-making. Just as an example, in Ojibwe tradition, if a parent was considered not to be capable of taking care of their child, then the elders council, usually the women council, would intervene and would say, we're going to move that child from these parents, but we will place this child with an auntie or with the grandparents. So the child would not be leaving the family and would not be leaving the community, which is different from what the child welfare system does now. And so the idea was to recognize that there was an ongoing relationship for the child with his or her identity. And every society always helped, and this is true for non-Indigenous societies as well, helped people to understand the answers to 4 questions. So the first one is, where do I come from? So what's my history? What's our history as a people? Where am I going? So what are my opportunities and obligations when I grow up? What are my responsibilities as an adult? And what happens when I die? Why am I here? So what's my purpose in life? And how do I learn about my purpose in life? And who am I in relation to creation? And so all of those answers are provided through the teachings of the people, not only in Indigenous society, but in non-Indigenous society as well. And the problem is that when children were taken away and placed in residential school, they were told that all of those belief systems were invalid, and they had to believe in accordance with what was being taught to the little white children, as they put it in the government policy at the time. And that idea that Indigenous people were inferior also was accompanied by the myth that non-Indigenous people were superior and that they came from a more advanced civilization. They came with better technology. They came with greater ideas. They came with organized forms of government. They came with an organized legal system. So that Indigenous people were way back there and non-Indigenous people were way up here. And so that was taught in the public school system as well. And so within the public schools, and non-Indigenous people were taught to believe that they were superior to Indigenous people. And that sense of the mythology of superiority, of course, is totally inaccurate when you look at the way things were at the beginning. And then you can see that there was much greater equality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Indigenous people, for example, did have a school system, but it was in accordance with the way they had traditionally taught children, usually in relation to their relationship to the land and to the creation, to the animals of creation, the beings of creation, all of that. But with the advent of the Confederation, Indigenous people wanted to have opportunities to educate their children so that they could function in this new society that was being created. And so within those schools, though, Indigenous children were taught they were inferior, non-Indigenous children were taught they were superior. And as a result, that relationship that was created within the schools was a negative relationship right from the get-go. And so the way it's affected non-Indigenous Canadians is that they have come to believe in the myth of their own superiority over Indigenous people. And they've come to believe in the myth of their own inherent right to sovereignty in this land. One of the most significant acts of reconciliation that Canada has yet to face is how do we reconcile Indigenous sovereignty with non-Indigenous sovereignty? Because the mere arrival of white people into North America did not create a sovereign relationship on the part of the white people. And that's the myth that non-Indigenous people have grown up with. And they need to unlearn that. They need to learn a more truthful story about what that relationship is going to be like. But it's a complicated process of answering because, we have a situation now where layer upon layer of policies and laws have been put in place based upon those mythologies. And so now we have to unravel all of that in a way that doesn't create chaos in our country. And that's going to be a challenge for you guys when you go to law school.